Call the meeting to order and welcome everybody to February 23rd, 2026 City Council work session. Can I get a roll call, please?
Councillor Gabrielle?
Here.
Councillor Blank?
Here.
Councillor Dowd?
Here.
Councillor Waterman?
Here.
Councillor Fisher? Councillor Leftridge?
Here. Here.
Councillor Nunnally?
Here.
Councillor Walker?
Here.
Mayor Hunter?
Here. We have one item on the agenda this evening, the ongoing Kalispell Land Use Plan Draft Review. Before we get to that, I'd like to open it up to public comment. It might be a long meeting, so for anyone wishing to address the council on this topic or any other topic, please step to the mic, state your name, or if you're online, raise your hand on the raise your hand feature. All right, seeing none, we'll turn to the agenda item. Mr. Nygren, staff report.
Yeah, Mayor and Council, continued discussion on the Montana Land Use Planning Act and the city's plan for that. Last meeting, we worked through Chapter 4. It's an extensive chapter, and with the short week, it was a bit hard to get all those edits in place by the time the council packet went out. We did send out the edits a bit earlier today, and as well as that, PJ is going to go over all those edits for the council as well as the public review. And then following that discussion, just lead into the rest of the chapters as time will allow. And with that, I'll turn it over to PJ.
All right, thanks. As Jared mentioned, just kind of stepping through first the edits that we made in Chapter 4 based on the council discussion last time. First one is relating to the broken window strategy, and this is where we put in, explore alternate enforcement strategies such as broken window strategy, and also added in the crime prevention through environmental design as something that was in there. Next one is page 61. And then this added in, including encouraging xeriscaping, drought-tolerant landscaping, and more efficient irrigation systems as one of our goals.
Do we want to include that as a recommendation as well, or move it to recommendation? I'm not entirely clear in terms of the best place, whether it's goal or recommendation or even policy, but would it make sense to have it in a different section or duplicate it?
It could be. I mean, those sections kind of overlap a little bit. I mean, ultimately, if we wanted to adopt some of those policies, and again, keeping in mind, and also for the public, that these aren't setting forth rules per se. It's kind of more guidance for future decisions on regulations that we might have, and whether it's in policies or goals doesn't make a huge difference. But if you wanted to have it in there, there's certainly no reason that you couldn't add that in under policies or recommendations as well.
Yeah, I just curious as to whether there's a real difference there in terms of how it's interpreted, what section it's in.
Not much. I mean, if in the future the council wanted to adopt more stringent regulations relating to, say, drought-tolerant landscaping, for example, we're looking at, like we talked about the last time, the landscape plan coming up. If the council wanted to have some of that incorporated into those new regulations, you could point to a land use plan goal and say, yeah, this is consistent with what our land use plan is, and then it's support for adopting that regulation in the future. And again, whether that's a goal or policy is a subtle difference, but again, it's certainly something that you can bump into that category as well if the council desires.
Yeah. I think as long as it's in there for now, it's probably fine.
Okay. Let's see here, 61, it's page 63. And so there's two spots that we had the biosolids. This was something that Public Works drafted, addressing some of the situations with glacier gold and the biosolids disposal that came up last time. And then somewhat related to that, then there in goals, with the initial one being called out as an issue, and then under goals. No comments there, kind of going down. I was going to note there was some discussion about underground tanks last time and the impact on the aquifer. And I think that as we step into Chapter 6 with the natural resources, I think there's some things that pretty directly address that. So I don't think any of that needed to be done here. Plus, it didn't fit in squarely with anything because it wasn't really a septic tank and it wasn't really a storm drainage issue per se. So anyway, I just wanted to address that since we didn't include any changes here for that. 69. This is where we added in expanded opportunities for recycling options, both in types of material being used and any methods or technologies that may be out there. So page 72, we added something about, reducing sprawl and transportation congestion through strategic zoning, compact development patterns, and well-defined commercial nodes. And that was tied under the transportation. Next page, added with less reliance on cul-de-sacs and other dead-end layouts, and that's kind of tied to the discussion that we had on the grid system. And then also added in roadway and bike and pedestrian connection over the Stillwater River. Going down to page 79. There was discussion about better exploring opportunities to coordinate some of those shared facilities. Near Peterson, as an example, it was out there where it's a city park right next to the school, and there's kind of a joint use of that. So there's some language that was added there. And then getting into parks and rec, we added a couple goals, pursuing equitable access to natural amenities, and ensuring that all residents have safe and convenient recreational opportunities. And then also added in exploring alternate uses of the Woodland Park Pond, such as a fishing pond, to accommodate changing site conditions and to better serve the public.
On the previous one, if you can scroll up, in terms of equitable access, it references the kind of public open spaces, but I was also thinking of Parks and Rec programming, like summer camps and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it wasn't intended to exclude that, but we can certainly add that in.
Yeah,
That'd be
just referencing that to be clear. I appreciate that.
Okay. Any other comments on any of the changes, or is that pretty much in line with what council was looking for? Okay. So then that jumps us into chapter 5. Which is economic development. I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the background information earlier in chapter 1 and chapter 2 kind of is the basis for this. Talks a lot about the available land under the zoning and the land use regulations that we have out there, and areas that are available for commercial, retail, or economic use that's out there. So the first page is really kind of some factual background on that, recognizing that Kalispell is a diverse area. It's kind of the central part of Flathead County as far as the center for healthcare and retail. Identifies the number of the main business areas, downtown, west side, South Kalispell, so forth. There's a couple maps in there and these were based on Census Bureau from 21, which is the most recent information that we could really reliably have, kind of outlining kind of the different areas in town. And a lot of this can tie back into housing. I think one thing that's important to note here is that we do have, I think both in the housing chapter and the economic development chapter, a recognition that housing is important to economic development too, because you need workforce housing, you need affordable places for your workers to live, and that's an important asset of the business community as well. The other one was just kind of breaking down by age. And once again, like in most of these areas, we have the issues and goals and policies and recommendations as we're stepping down through here. And a lot of the issues that you're looking at here, just kind of calling out, one thing we've noted in here, Kalispell, for example, is even though we're the commercial center of the valley, we only have 25% of the area's population. So that ties into transportation, people that might be coming from out in Kyla or something like that into work in the city or coming into school. That's a factor that we need to consider. It's looking at the fact that some of the traditional economic base of Kalispell, wood products are tied to the railroad or agriculture, have, not completely gone away, but have been kind of displaced somewhat by healthcare and tourism-based jobs. And so you've kind of seen over the decades kind of a change in the base of the economy that we've had here. Once again, noting joint planning being something that can sometimes be difficult, but has a lot of benefits since we are kind of one community, not just a series of independent organizations. We did add in some language about some of the tax rate revisions that were done and the impact that that's significant impact that that's had on the business community here. Certainly called that out as an issue. I'm not sure what we can do with that as the city, but it's certainly something that we have to work through when we're looking at the economic base. And noting that even some of the commercial zoning in the community could use infrastructure upgrades to better serve that. One example, even just in the core downtown area, would be the need to have some better access to fire lines for some of the redevelopment downtown. But that's just one example out there. There's certainly other areas that could use upgrades that would boost some of that. I think the tie back into the facilities plans that we have speak a lot to that. When you look at the water and sewer plans, transportation and stormwater, part of that is looking at redevelopment of those areas and what might need to be done if that were to happen.
I had a question about that number 9. Just greater commercial industrial development in the county. I mean, we've had quite a bit. Is that when we look at just kind of outside of Kalispell city limits, is that accurate that there's more commercial development?
I think it is. I don't think it's necessarily saying that more than 50% of it occurs outside. And if you want to clarify, this is old language that we've had in there for a while. But I think what it's doing is it's recognizing that the urban development standards and the rural development standards are very different. And sometimes developers will make the choice to locate outside the city limits, away from sewer, which ties into some of the aquifer issues that we've had, because it's less expensive. They don't necessarily require sidewalks. They don't have to put in sewer main extensions. And that, again, kind of ties into what we've touched on repeatedly, is that it's not just a city of Kalispell issue. When we look at these, what we do impacts what happens on the other side of the city limits line too, and vice versa. So it's kind of a recognition of that, and it's an important balance to keep in mind as people come forward with development proposals.
I think if we don't have specific data showing that, maybe hedging on it and just saying it could incentivize development outside, or something like that.
We can tweak that, but yeah, it's a real issue. I don't know that we could put a number on it, so yeah, that's fine.
That's what I was just gonna ask, did you put a number on it?
I don't know that we could, but I can absolutely guarantee that it's an issue
Okay.
out there. So, yeah, but yeah, we can clarify the language on that.
In general, the
That's no problem.
service is probably not as much, but certainly industrial and uses that don't really care about their location. Industrial especially, you look at the Highway 2 corridor out by the airport and through the airport, it's real. There's a lot of industry out there that has not come into the city. And I think, the city, we do focus a lot on built environment and quality and landscaping and all these things that industrial business don't really care about. And thus it does tend to push that type of industry outside of the city.
One of the issues called out here too, and this is number 13, when you're looking at the state liquor license laws and some of the impact that has, especially as we're looking at the downtown area and maybe how to revitalize that and create that critical mass. That's another one, just like with that tax structures, I don't know what we can necessarily do with the city with that. I think there's some things that we would certainly try to do with certain, and I think we have with our zoning incentives in the B3 area, for example, the core area, where we reduced parking requirements by 50%, didn't have any setbacks and so forth to try to incentivize development to happen in there. So there's a few things that we can do to try to encourage that, but it's definitely an issue with the liquor license laws, especially at how it impacts Kalispell relative to some other communities out there. Getting into goals, we certainly want to encourage adequate supply of jobs, higher median incomes, and a stable, diversified economy. Would always be monitoring growth trends to make sure that we're in tune with all of that. We're definitely a regional healthcare center, and we want to continue to support those efforts as well as a regional retail center. And you also kind of get into some of the commercial and industrial districts and wanting a viable mix, not necessarily focusing in on one specific sector at the expense of others, but you want to have that mix that's out there. Scrolling down with this. Getting into policies.
Before we go there, just that number 9, kind of residential areas and avoiding encroachment. Want to make sure that we preserve the option in the future of talking about compatible business in residential areas. We've had, some of our old neighborhoods has, older business uses in the neighborhoods, and currently wouldn't be, allowed with current zoning. That we might look at zoning in the future that allows for compatible businesses and kind of residential areas. I want to make sure that, we don't have, I mean, obviously this is kind of general enough, it's probably fine, but I just want to flag that that might be something in the future we want to.
It's something, and yeah, and there's a lot of layers to that. I mean, certainly, an existing commercial use that's in a residential zone would be grandfathered in. So, it's not really an issue. It's about a new one kind of coming in, and what's appropriate there. I think that a key thing is what is incompatible in these situations. In the history of zoning, I mean, what really started that was trying to separate out, hardcore industrial uses from residential areas. So, even though you'd want to encourage some mixed use, there's certain things that you don't necessarily want to mix in together. And I think the other aspect here too is it talks about well established. So there's kind of a little difference how you would approach an existing established single family neighborhood as opposed to maybe a new development where you can mix some of those uses from the start. So, but yeah, good point. Again, going down into policies, we certainly want to provide adequate space for growth. And I think that when you look at some of the figures, again, going back to chapter 2, there's a lot of existing commercial area. Not all of it's necessarily subdivided and ready to build on, but the zoning and the land use designations allow for that for somebody to come in. So there's available space for growth of the commercial sector to keep pace with the population growth that we'd be seeing. Yeah, certainly working with economic development organizations to further the goals that we establish here through the land use plan. There is quite a bit in here on highway community entrance standards, which is something that was incorporated into the zoning 8 or 9 years ago, something along those lines. But essentially what we're trying to do there is kind of, like you see with A is, emphasizing the objective of pleasing corridors. You'd have landscaping through there. You'd bring the buildings back a little bit and reduce some of the distractions that you might have in terms of signage right up against that. And where we really apply those is really on the 4 main entrances.
Provide that kind of, I guess, scenic greenery and stuff without having, big setbacks with our existing boulevards or maybe slightly expanded boulevards. But what I really like to see is, buildings that are up to the sidewalk so that pedestrians who are using that sidewalk can easily access and interact with businesses that are along that road to make that street more dynamic, more engaging for the public rather than just something that you drive through and then you drive into.
Right, and I think what we've seen in a lot of those areas is that open space, because one of the things that you put in the open space, and we actually see a lot in there, would be bike and pedestrian paths that might not necessarily have space available for them otherwise. But for example, running up north, you've got the bike paths running through there. So there's multiple things that are in there, multiple ways of dealing with that open space. And the width of it varies. In some areas it's only 20 feet wide, but getting a little bit of that green space as you're coming through is probably a positive thing as far as the appearance as you're coming into town. So.
Yeah, I guess I have a difference of opinion on that. I mean, I think we can have wider sidewalks or paths to accommodate the biking, but it's not, given that all these entrances are going to be very heavily trafficked roads, they're not going to be used as kind of a recreational trail. They're not going to be popular for that purpose. And I do think adding that extra width really creates a visual problem just in terms of that sense of enclosure, but also for the pedestrian engaging, as I said, with the street.
Yeah, like in Whitefish, right? In the entrance to Whitefish, you have that winding trail sidewalk to nothing. Like it doesn't connect to any of the businesses along the side. It just kind of winds through the green space along the highway for a good mile, but it doesn't really interact with anything. And I almost never see anybody using it because it's right along the highway. Sorry. Because it's right along the highway. No one wants to use that path. There's nothing between the path and the highway, but 4-inch curb. So if someone loses control, there's nothing to protect a pedestrian along that path. And so if we open it up and just make a path that doesn't interact with any of the businesses along there, I don't see how that's useful.
And through our site review, that's typically something that we look at, and sometimes in the subdivision, but often through site review, when we're looking at the building permits and specific site development, would be connections to bike paths like that, or to a sidewalk if you're kind of going the other way. But like I said,
There's a long history to this.
there's
yes.
a long
A
history.
lot of councils and a lot of ideas, so I think that's what this boils down to. This was a very important thing for previous councils. All you gotta do is look at Highway 93 South. A majority of that, even people assume is in the city, is not, it's in the county. Slowly, it's coming into the city, and you see those developments, like the new Whitefish Credit Union down on the south end of town. That's what our standard is. We do require pedestrian connection to the sidewalk. So it's differing opinions. I think the idea, it was kind of a rebuttal of what had happened in Evergreen and Highway 93 South, and they want to beautify the corridor and preserve the highway as a highway. You know, what are we getting the most complaints about now? Main Street and the noise and stuff, right? So I understand the Main Street feel. It's certainly a good option, but the idea has been that's going to be a highway, a 45-mile-an-hour highway. It's going to be noisy. Let's set businesses back and do it that way. So that's the reasoning behind that. Certainly you could shift, but it would definitely be a different methodology or a different idea of how that should develop. And I guess the idea is, do we want Main Street all the way to Whitefish? I guess that's kind of what you would have to determine, so.
Well, I think we do see a lot of recreational use along that northern corridor, right? Living up there, I don't know if you've noticed that. When I moved up there and bought my grandparents' house originally, I always thought, well, man, this trail will never get used. Doggone, even in the winter when there's a pile of snow there, here comes bikes, fat tire bikes, and folks snowshoeing you have even seen, right? And cross-country skiing when the snow is up there and it's not cleared. So it is used as recreational, and there is a lot of recreational amenities with kid sports and even going back to the college and stuff like that. I appreciate what the city has done to get it to that point, and I would hate to see that change up there.
I'm a
It's
little,
even more, sorry, more history to that. You start to see it potentially connecting the north end and the south end, and you got these small, you start to see it potentially connecting the north end and the south end, and you got these small gaps, and all of a sudden everything is connected, and you can travel by e-bike or whatever on some of those paths. So that's the idea. It's certainly not a very urban built environment, but it was kind of intended to be that way.
I did, for the record, share by email a AI-generated image of what 93 North would look like if we actually built it at a kind of more like a Main Street style, with the developments up to the sidewalk and not kind of a wide buffer on it, and obviously higher density as well, with a mix of housing and retail. And you know, we've had some developments now and where we have this wide buffer, and personally I don't like it. I don't think it gives the sense of sprawl to me. Part of it too is other, accompanying regulations of having the buildings face the street, having a front door, because sometimes there are a path to the building, but the path goes to the back of the building or the side of the building, and it's just a wall. There's no door to it. So that's part of the problem too. Sometimes the path, you go downstairs or path and accesses a parking lot. Again, that's not going to be pedestrian friendly. So personally, I would like to see a change in the standards so that we do encourage more of a Main Street. I don't like the idea of sacrificing this corridor just to highway. I think it creates a dead space in our community when it could be so much more, and it could be a space that's used. And again, to the extent that people are using it as bike trails, nothing would prevent that from what I'm proposing. You would still have a sidewalk that would be potentially a wider sidewalk, but I don't think that extra green space on the other side, extending, putting the buildings at a further extent, achieves anything.
I got two comments on this. First off, I'm having trouble envisioning putting a building right next to a 45 to 65 mile hour road, right? That just seems like a dangerous situation. And the second thing is, I like that we have kind of allowed developers to create their own plan to their own tastes for their own private property. And, you know, some of this is possible when you get really close into the city, but when you get farther out, it's going to look a little bit strange when you have just rows of buildings all the way down the highway, you know?
I guess that's the question. Where does the highway stop and the city start, right? Because I feel like a highway should be a highway, right? It should be limited access, high speed, get you from point A to point B, limited stops, limited interruptions, right? But once you get to a city, you're in the city. That's a destination.
Sure.
And so the standard should be different. And so I guess that's the question. Where do we want the highway standard to stop and the city to start, right? Because to me, they should be different.
I agree with that, but there also that, you know, there is the concept of that transition zone where you're slowing
Sure.
down from the highway to city street, you know, speeds.
Sure.
I don't know. I just don't. I haven't seen a big problem in this area. Maybe it's because I live on the south side and everything's like ugly down there, right? It's just older industrial and it's being brought into the city, but it's already has those uses, so there's not much we can do with it, right? The other thing just to point out is this is a strategic planning document, and anything like real tactical that we want to do, we need to do in like zoning or whatever instead. But I'm just having trouble. I'm having trouble putting that statement into this section under a strategy, unless you know we kind of define exactly what you're saying. Where's the highway stop? Where's the city start? Because the fact is, our on the north end, our city goes pretty far, and it's you know way up there where you know Costco and that is now, and farther on the other side of the highway. So
Can I give you a little? So the way this works is this was a goal and a policy in the previous growth policy that goes back based off the history and experience in the valley. And it was all about beautifying and the quality of life in Kalispell and trying to beautify the corridors. Be like, you're coming to Kalispell. There could be different ways you look at it. It could be an urban environment, but the idea was you're going to green space our entrances. And the way this then is implemented is it transitioned out of just a growth policy document into actual zoning ordinance. So this is the time, although it's something that would need a lot of thought, not that the council could reevaluate, but certainly then it's going to take some changes in the zoning ordinance as well. And the landscape buffers and things are all based off of the highway speeds and things like that. So Highway 93 north of Reserve, because it's 45 plus, it's a 100-foot setback. If it's 35, so it's based off of speeds and projected noises and things like that. That's where the setbacks came from. So,
Right. And just to expand off that a little bit is that, you know, if it was a change that the council was going through, it's not just based in the land use plan itself, but then there's the Highway 93 North Area Plan, which I kind of scrolled down to here, which was adopted in 2006 by the council. And one of the main points of that is establishing those entrance corridor standards. Yeah, and that's kind of the map, but you got to like turn that way. But that's most of what they're talking here with goal 1 is gateway interest is Kalispell enhanced community through improved design, and really is calling out exactly what Jared was talking about there. But it was a similar thing through the South Corridor Area Plan, which was adopted in 2008. So there's 2 specific neighborhood plans out there, and the neighborhood plans we're not adopting through this process. This is kind of jumping up a little bit to Chapter 9. We could touch on that, but under MALUPA, we're supposed to incorporate all of the existing neighborhood plans. And if you want to amend those, you go through a whole separate process as a neighborhood plan for that specific neighborhood. So, you know, there'd be a number of steps. It'd be the neighborhood plans. It would be an amendment of what that policy has been, not only under the.
Doesn't make any sense to me because it's only outskirts for, you know, a decade or two, and then it's going to be just part of the city. And so we should determine what we want our city to be. And then in terms of the highway speeds, I do have a problem with 60, 70 mile per hour roads within city limits with development on either side. If you have 60, 70 mile per hour roads in the city, it needs to be a bypass, limited access freeway with on-ramps, off-ramps, sound walls, that's what you have in a city for a 60, 70 mile per hour road. If you're going to do this where you have all this development on it with, lighted intersections, and we'll have a conversation apparently coming up soon about, that lighted intersections, which I have some issues with as well. But if we're going to do that, then it should be a road that is, 35 miles per hour or less. It should be our main street type of development and traffic and so on. And people, as Mr. Walker spoke to, just need to come to expect that when you're in the city, you can't expect to go 67 miles per hour with development on either side of the road.
If part of the county is brought into the city that includes like 93, let's say, do we have any, we don't set those speeds still, right? Because it's still technically Highway 93.
Correct.
Highway
We don't,
93
MDT has all jurisdiction over the highway.
In the past,
think
have they
that
been
the
responsive to
cities-
us asking for slower
The
speeds?
city's goal is to, as development's happening, knowing that we've had to build a bypass and do these things, which cost hundreds of millions of dollars, is to try and preserve the highway, knowing that certainly as like the development happens off the highway, nothing.
So you want basically four-sided architectural design on the buildings up there on the north, so that if you come in the back, you can walk in the back? Is that what?
With parking in the back, that you'd have multiple entrances, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
potentially you would have access for pedestrians on the sidewalk side and entrance for.
I think I can certainly agree in certain areas that would be good. I would hate to set that as a policy for the city all overall, right? We saw that happen in Whitefish. They went to a four-sided architectural where you could access from multiple sides, and it caused their food bank, which shouldn't have to be millions of dollars to build a small building to house a food bank, to spend millions of dollars to build a food bank. So I want to be cautious in how we roll something like that out, because it can certainly have a negative effect also on development, but also on your services and everything, right? So I agree that there has to be, if you're going to have that, double-sided, how do you make that work? But right, I just want to make sure that we're not going whole hog into it and get into a situation where unintended consequences make them build in the county.
I will say, with the highway, I think we're setting up, I've kind of mentioned this before, I think we're setting up just a kind of a traffic congestion nightmare with the highways north and south. If we continue to insist that it be a rural highway of 60, 70 miles per hour, but we're also going to load all this development onto it with lighted intersections, but only, putting some sort of limit on the lighted intersections, so you only have them every, whatever it is, half a mile or, mile or something like that. The end result is a nightmare, in my opinion, in terms of traffic congestion. You're better off creating a Main Street type situation that is a destination in itself, and people psychologically know that. And I understand that, we don't have, that's MDT, and I'm hoping we get to a point where MDT listens more to local communities. And I hope through our planning and documents like this, we send the message to MDT that putting a rural highway or expecting a rural highway through the city is no longer acceptable. That they need a shift in their own philosophy. But I think from what I read in planning theory and research and experience, that trying to preserve rural highways in cities doesn't work. Doesn't work for our Main Street. It won't work for our entrance corridors. And I want us to move away from it. And that's, I guess, the last I'll put on that.
Okay. Going down to recommendations, supporting public-private partnerships, that's strengthening commercial districts in the city. There's a lot of efforts that we do with that. coordinating employment and educational services. Discussed earlier, how important housing is to support the workforce and how that's a business consideration in addition to a living or housing situation. Certainly want to try to develop incentives wherever we can or pursue grants and be proactive at the state level. We want to explore alternate funding mechanisms. A lot of these come down to trying to be creative when you're looking at commercial redevelopment. And that kind of brings us to the end of chapter 5. So was there anything that anybody wanted to bring
Couple
up?
questions I have, specifically with this number 6 here with the market study. It doesn't really clarify who the market study's for. I mean, does there need to be more clarification? I mean, it says you do a market study, but is it for?
I think it was, again, this is language that's been in there since at least 2018, right? And so if it was something that, council wanted to fund a study for that, you could craft it around what you would necessarily see might be important at the time.
Okay.
And certain things might be more important in a COVID era than they might be 5 years later. But it's intended to be general in there and not necessarily targeting a specific sector of what's out there.
Well, it's fairly general right now. That's
Yeah.
Yeah, an example that ironically kind of has been somewhat solved, but would have been during the COVID time, the daycare needs for private business and industry, and like,
Kind of address that.
okay.
Yeah, you'd want to call that off from here to another source, though, right? You don't want to actually put it in here because we'll end up having to change it all the time. Like when the opportunity zones arrive and then disappear.
Yeah, well, it's kind of calling out with what the current ones are. I don't know that we necessarily change that because it's not really a city created. It's not like a zoning district that would be creating per se. And there's a lot of things in this document that are just kind of looking at what the landscape is right now in terms of taxes or opportunity zones that might be out there. But showing that something's in there and that's the way that they could be developed, and it kind of shows you areas of town that might be redeveloped. So, I mean, putting in a map identifying those is certainly something we can look at, and we can put it in for the next draft, and if it works, or we can leave it in, or if not, we can pull it out.
I guess I look at it from just the pure developer perspective. Somebody who's coming in from out of the area, they're looking at our documents. They're looking at a document which is about land use, sites, economic development. Maybe you're going to go into that section. And if that's giving some information, not only for future councils, but also for a developer to be like, let's research more.
Yeah.
I mean, like, is the opportunity zone something I could leverage? I know that we highlight the tax increment districts as well, because it gives, again, that sort of somebody new to the scene an opportunity to look at what the economic opportunities are in here, and it's sort of spelled out of, there are partners, there are challenges that we've seen, but opportunity zone is the one that's sort of missing for me.
Yeah.
But happy to see whatever
Okay.
else we're able to
We'll
list.
put something
Just because
together.
it just seems like it's a rubrics for somebody who is developing and looking for their opportunities to look at, they'd be able to identify in this chapter that these would be the zones that I'd be looking at. These might be the opportunities I should be considering. Here's some market studies that might be developed that would be helpful for me. And again, since economy is really emphasized in the whole document from the very beginning of the vision statement, sort of want to make sure that this is a robust resource section, not only for future council, but also for, like I say, somebody new to Kalispell looking to learn more about the community.
Yeah. No, we'll put something together and see if that works. Okay.
How do I know today if I'm a developer, even if I'm internal, because a lot of the internal, like to the valley developers don't even know about some of these zones. Where do I go to find these today? Well, what's available out there as far as opportunity zones, tax increment districts, everything that would be like beneficial to build and start at a cheaper cost.
Yeah. Well, certainly when you're talking about the tax increment districts, it's something we've got on our website and works through community development department to work with people on that. And those are identified zones that are out there. Again, you can, the best way, Jared, do you know the best way to do opportunity zone?
people that know about opportunity zones know how to take advantage of them and know where they are. That's the reality of it. Developers know. Developers go to conferences and they learn about these things and they learn the tax advantages. And the silos is an opportunity zone. That's why it's there. Parkline Towers is an opportunity zone. That's why it's there. And so there's, the city doesn't really have to promote those things per se. Not that we shouldn't. We should make that information available, but they know where those lie. TIF districts and things are different. Certainly larger developers are gonna know how to utilize those tools, but it's more the mom and pops and things that just,
Well, a couple of those like are opportunity zones and inside of a TIF district, right? So that would
Yes.
be a
Yes.
double opportunity for some. Anyway, I was just wondering where they go today to find that information out. If there's if they go to the city or if they go to some government website somewhere, or how they know about them today.
All an opportunity zone is a census tract. That's all it is. It's a census tract that's got a median income qualifier, and it's in a redevelopment area. So the Kalispell Opportunity Zone is actually kind of oddly shaped. It's like a U, pretty much goes around downtown, and it actually only catches the west and east sides of even the TIF districts. It doesn't even, like the Gateway of West Mall, for example, it's not even in it. It's kind of the west and the east sides. So it's an oddly shaped thing that ties to a census tract. So it's not, doesn't necessarily always make the most sense, but then that, like I said, is tied to like an area median income with a redevelopment opportunity, and then a developer would get some sort of tax breaks and things for developing in those areas.
All right, thanks.
Okay, so anything else on chapter 5?
Yeah, sorry, PJ, I hate to go backwards. But looking at issue number 8 in regard to the 2025 legislative session and the changes to the tax rates for businesses in particular, recognizing, I agree with all of this and I understand why it's put in there, and it's a good highlight of the issue, but recognizing that we may not revisit this for another 5 years, and it's supposed to be in place for 20 years, I'd be in favor of making this a little more broad. Recommendation 7, which talks about our interaction with the state in terms of being able to advocate on a statewide level, we could reference issue number 8 to be more broad, something like the fluctuation in state mandated tax rates are able to, so we can talk about the impact and uncertainty based on that fluctuation. Is that
Right, to
make sense?
encompass something that might happen in 27, right?
Right. I mean, everything might change next year, right? But recognizing that there may be unintended consequences, we can still come back to this and use our policies in order to advocate based upon that changing dynamic.
Yeah. Okay. All right, anything else in chapter 5? Okay. So chapter 6, it's a long chapter in terms of pages, but it involves natural resources, environment, and hazards. And I think what's important to understand with how this chapter is structured is the vast bulk of it, after the first several pages of issues and goals and so forth, is really kind of like background information. There's a lot of maps that we got from Fish and Wildlife, identifying, wildlife habitat, identifying, seismic areas, identifying hydric soils, just a lot of different things. So it's a lot of background information. Really love the city of Kalispell and love living here. So number 1 really kind of ties into that in a strong way. It's looking at 100-year floodplains prevalent in many areas. One thing I would note with this is that there's a lot of 100-year floodplain that's around Kalispell, and a fair amount that's within our planning jurisdiction. There's not a lot that's actually within the city limits. It's pretty restricted because if you kind of think about it, a lot of the rivers are down below and the city kind of sits up a little bit higher there. So it's certainly an area-wide issue. It's not to diminish that there are some areas through town where that's an issue, but I think, when you start talking about impacts of, a 64 flood or something like that, a lot of that is down in Evergreen, not in the city of Kalispell per se.
In terms of, we got a number of public comment around the floodplain issue and discussion of, there should be discussion of 500-year floodplain as well when we talk about like a 64 event or, an event that's possible that would be beyond the 100-year floodplain, kind of talking more broadly about some of the impacts of an event like that and what it would mean for the community and that sort of thing.
You can, and I think that, first of all, just in terms of background, what's pretty standard and what City of Kalispell does, you regulate to the 100 year. So any given year, there's a 1% chance of flooding, right? 500 year takes that out quite a bit larger. That's typically not something that you regulate to. I think that being said, you'd certainly recognize that there can be certain things that would come up. I think most of the flooding events that I've seen within the city of Kalispell have been, say, like late February, where it's frozen ground and you get a bunch of snow and then it warms up and everything melts with the rain, but it can't soak into the ground and, kind of floods out that way. Whereas a lot of the stuff that you would see in the lower lying areas might be more, May to June when you get that runoff coming down the main rivers. So, but there's the hazard mitigation plan. I think everybody's kind of touched on that earlier this year too. I think that's a very appropriate place to look at things. I don't know that we'd want to regulate to the 500 year, and I know that comment came through as more of like an education type of a thing, and something like that can certainly be appropriate. I don't know that we would want to regulate to that. A lot of the older part of town would be in 500 year, and if you start regulating there, then it would really mess up an awful lot of remodel jobs and garages people might be putting in the older part of
And
town.
that's sort of actually how I read a lot that the public comment was the importance of education, not necessarily regulation. That building community awareness is different, and I guess we're not citing out all the education opportunity. I mean, that's
Right.
I would agree with you that was sort of the comment, was the importance of public education or awareness of an issue,
And I think that's
not necessarily regulating to it.
right. And it's important. But I wanted to make sure there was that distinction because
Yeah.
typically the things that are in here form the basis for regulations or land use decisions as opposed to establishing an education program per se. And just making sure that that was kind of clear. The other thing is that there are some nationwide movements to start regulating towards the 500 year. Which I think would really impact our community quite a bit, especially established neighborhoods in the older part of town. The other thing that came through with that was the community rating system. I think there's about 10 communities maybe in the state that do that, but basically it's almost like an iOS rating that you'd be more familiar with fire, but this would apply to flood. And we've looked at that at a number of times over the years, and the issue that we run into is, as I was saying, there's not that much development in the city of Kalispell that's in the floodplain. Most of it's outside. Most of the development that we've done, we don't, because our subdivision regulations for the city, which is a local regulation, we don't allow subdivisions to occur within the floodplain area. So you're not doing that development within the floodplain. So we really haven't added much development into the floodplain. So the amount, it's kind of a cost benefit analysis in a sense, where the amount of time and money that the city would have to put in to just kind of step in at, like a rating of 8 or 9 doesn't really justify a relatively small decrease in floodplain insurance for the city of Kalispell. So I don't know if the CRS thing would necessarily make sense, but certainly it's putting in something as far as education, because things can happen with ice dams or things, even if it's not in the 500 year flood. I mean, you can have culverts that jam up, whether it's by ice or debris. And those are all real things that can happen, whether it's 100 year floodplain or not, or a 500 year floodplain or not.
Is the CRS predicated on the 100-year floodplain or the 500-year?
CRS is more about your floodplain management program. And so what it requires, there's a lot of outreach type of things that go along with that. How you regulate, and just like with the iOS with fire, is the stricter you get with those regulations is where you start getting down to say like a 4 or a 3 or something and see more of those benefits. But there's just a very limited amount in the city. I think we looked at, there was 15 commercial structures in the city, and at least a couple of those were like the ticket booth at the baseball field. And there just wasn't enough to justify that expenditure with the city. I would certainly recognize again that, education is important with that, and trying to keep that in mind as we develop properties is important. But anyway,
And there are a number of nonprofits that, at this point in time, are willing to help the city do these things. So there's potential partnership there that may not take a lot of city resources. So something along those lines would be good, but it can take a lot of city resources for little benefit, because the city's got so little. They don't have enough properties in it to kind of warrant the process that justifies a community rating system. The county is in the community rating system because, for example, most Evergreen is in it. So it warrants that, because then it reduces all those potential insurance rates, right? But in Kalispell, essentially you get a handful of properties that would benefit, but essentially have to pay a lot of staff time to do that.
This public comment, I understood that it was something like 1,000 residences or something like that is within.
they were included Evergreen. So where they took that from was the hazard mitigation plan.
Okay.
And the stats that they used included the Kalispell area.
Oh,
And so we actually ran the same, we used GIS to kind of figure that out for what was actually in the city, and that's where we came down to, I can't remember the number of residential, but it was like 15 commercial, again, with some of them being just real minor, like ticket booth kind of things. It was very restricted in the city. So I would fully acknowledge that it's kind of a regional issue around the city of Kalispell, not so much within our
It's in our growth
jurisdiction.
policy, though. It's in our growth area, though, right?
Right, but we can't regulate
Well,
from
right.
there.
But I mean, we
So-
we talking about other things, about having policies so that if the county wants to do something that we don't like on our border, right, that we can write a letter and tell them how much we disagree with them building in the floodplain or whatever, right? If we have a policy or a plan that says we're against that, is there no benefit to that here?
Well, we wouldn't develop in the floodplain. It's already in our rules. So even if it is in our growth policy, if it's in the city annexation, our growth, in our existing growth boundary, other than Evergreen itself, then yeah, we would not be, which Evergreen, you'll see it's in our broader growth policy map. It's not in our annexation map.
Right.
So, and Evergreen would fall under the CRS already because they're part of the county. So, but anything within our growth area, within our annexation boundary wouldn't be developed in the floodplain to begin with. So then that wouldn't apply to the CRS as well, wouldn't count towards that.
Well, we just approved not long ago a development in the floodplain, allowing fill. So we do develop in the floodplain as long as they put fill in it, which,
Well, it's not considered, that's a different process. There's a FEMA process called, you start off with the Clomer F, which is a conditional letter of map revision based on fill, which removes it from the floodplain. So from a regulatory perspective, it's not within the floodplain. And they go through a 3-step process in order to do that. So they get the conditional letter of map revision from FEMA, which probably takes about 8 months or something. They have to get then a floodplain development permit because flood regulations do allow you to, and what I'd say is, an important distinction here too, is that it's their subdivision regulations that don't allow you to subdivide. Floodplain regulations nationwide allow you to build in a floodplain. You just have to elevate it above fill. Under City of Kalispell, it's 2 feet above base flood elevation to finished floor. So you can see development happening in the floodplain. It's more restricted in the city because we don't allow that subdivision to happen in there. So you're not creating lots and kind of expanding in that area with that. So
but we did have a subdivision development in under your floodplain.
but from FEMA's perspective, that was removed from the flood maps. It was
Yes.
no longer in there.
I don't make that distinction. If you put fill in the floodplain, you're displacing the floodwaters and you're gonna worsen the flood elsewhere in the community. Like, I understand that FEMA permits it. I think it's a major problem from our federal regulation standpoint. But anyway, I don't want to get into that regulation. In terms of, so 15 commercial within the,
Within the City of Kalispell.
within the city, and residential,
It wasn't a lot more. I can't remember what the number was off the top of my head with that, but it was nowhere near the numbers that were presented with that.
Do we know how many are in the annexation boundary?
What's that?
Do we know how many are in the annexation boundary?
I don't know that. So,
I think the folks who are advocating for this, that did offer resources for the city to engage in it. I don't know if I would like to be open to it, and if they're willing to kind of cover the resources to the extent that we feel that it's then worth, it in terms of the resource versus what you get out of it, then I think it'd be worth doing. But it depends on what kind of resources they bring to the table. But it does seem to me like if there are some properties that would benefit from lower insurance rates, and we might be bringing more properties into the city that would be impacted, even if they wind up filling it, which would be a problem. And we can get on this community rating system that's beneficial with the expenses of doing that kind of covered, or at least largely covered by this group, then I see it beneficial. But obviously that's contingent on some of that funding and stuff. So I'd like to at least,
We could add something about having partnerships, pursuing partnerships that allow for continued education or something along those lines. That certainly we could do something like that.
okay. Jump in here. Soil stability and erosion is something that we've talked about a lot, especially along some of the bluffs that we know that can slip, particularly along Whitefish and Stillwater rivers. We have a provision here about water quality being an important issue to the community. and looking at that in terms of the Flathead River Basin, not just within the city of Kalispell. The noxious weeds, this is actually something that you would see come up in most of our subdivision plats, where we include a condition that says that disturbed areas need to be revegetated as one of our standard conditions. Getting into goals, you'd want to encourage developments compatible with natural resources. Jump down here in a minute, but I'll just scroll to in a second. But there's an environmentally sensitive area map where we need to try to leave those in a relatively undisturbed state. But just jumping down to that, this is something that we've used for a while. You can see the rivers off in this direction. You can see the slopes coming off mostly towards the southwest of town. Also calling out hydric soils as part of this. It's a little bit out of order with here, but one thing I did kind of want to point out, and we'll talk about it a little bit with the land use map, is this kind of really illustrates how the development of the city, why it's happening towards the west and to the north. And what you can see is you're coming down through this stretch with all this topography, we can't really grow in that direction. Besides the topography, you've got the Lone Pine Park there, and it's just can't go that way. You've got floodplain and the river down through here, so you kind of narrow in the south, just this real narrow kind of corridor that could be developed through here. As you're coming up, you've got evergreen and more river and everything that comes up through here, and that's why you're really seeing so much growth happening to the west and to the north in town, is because that's where things are kind of pushed to. Besides that, now that you've got the the bypass coming around, you've got the west side interceptor coming around. It's just prime for growth through those areas, partly out of necessity and partly because that's where the opportunities are for that. But again, that was kind of deviating a little bit, but this is a core map that we look at when we're looking at environmentally sensitive areas when people are looking at development.
Another thing to add to that, and it is in our goals and policies as well. It is in our goals and policies, but as part of subdivisions and stuff, there is additional environmental analysis, site-specific, that is done as well. So this is more of a policy-wide, high-value or high-level map that, as developments happen, additional information comes in.
Next goal here is
Gabriel.
PJ,
sorry.
just one quick thing, whoever has the master document on this, on number 4, environmentally needs to be fixed.
Okay. There's going to be 1 or 2 typos that slip in there.
That's what I said, whoever is the master.
On the map of the sensitive areas, I do think it is missing a big environmentally sensitive area, which, referring to that northwest area, but the pothole wetlands, we had that big conversation about the crane habitat, but
And there's some other discussion where we call some of that out, so
okay.
we can touch on that.
But I do think it should be reflected in the map of environmentally sensitive area.
Okay. So number 4 in goals, and this is something we kind of touched on before too, about how you're encouraging infills to prevent sprawl out into the other areas that we don't really want development to happen. Development should be compatible with important wildlife habitat corridors, but also recognizing then, and we actually, this is an important part of our conversation with Fish and Wildlife, is they would rather have us have infill happen than have that sprawl happen. And so I think that there's a lot of alignment on what that means once you recognize that growth is happening in the city. Some of these, protecting health integrity of the natural environment, protecting wetlands and riparian areas, listing some of the benefits that you would get through there with flood protection, water quality, and habitat. This is kind of related back to 4 with higher density mixed use on lands within and close to the city limits to kind of prevent that sprawl. Similar with large lot development, do what we can with the county to preserve some of those ag lands, and a diverse urban forestry program, which, Parks does a pretty good job of. And that jumps down into policies. First one, the encouraging infill clustering, compact development, maintaining high water quality, load reduction for the Flathead Basin, development areas known to have high groundwater should be discouraged until public sewer is available. And you see that common theme through a lot of that. Encouraging conservation easements and noxious weed control. Again, the wildlife corridors through here, again, with that similar language about kind of really trying to promote that infill and close to the city development as opposed to sprawl. Preventing compromises to the built and natural environment. Utilities should be placed underground. We do that. And this is another spot where I know dark sky compliant stuff came up before. This is another place that's reflected in there. And then it calls out, certain areas that, in general, that should be taken into consideration when you're looking at development, including the 100-year floodplain, wet plains, riparian areas, shallow aquifers, which kind of goes back to the tank issue that we talked about, streams, rivers, steep slopes, and some of those high banks that are prone to sloughing. Recommendations, coordinating with the county, coordinating regulatory programs involving floodplains and other issues that would be out there. Another spot where you're looking at the dark sky compliant language. Again, number 4, protecting shallow aquifers as sensitive water quality zones and establish performance standards, coordinating with the Flathead Land Trust, and get some language in there with the urban forestry management plan.
I would, just to go back on the number 7, in terms of conservation easements, protecting existing trees within developments. No, back
Down
here. Yeah. So just to, I think this is a common confusion about conservation easements, so I want to clarify, and I think might need to be clarified on this point, which is, land trusts, we protect larger acreage properties, ag and forest land and so forth. You're not going to find, either with Flathead Land Trust or really any land trust, going to work with a developer and conserve like a homeowners association green space for a number of reasons. One, because it can be seen as helping the development through the permitting process, which land trusts don't want to be involved with by kind of that public relations side of conserving certain portions of the development. But more importantly, we have a monitoring enforcement obligation, and being able to work with like a community space where all these property owners within a development are using it as public recreation space and have joint ownership through a homeowner association is an enforcement nightmare. And so we don't engage in that. So kind of the idea of the developers protecting some existing trees, I think would be great, but it wouldn't be done through a conservation easement.
Okay. And so that kind of brought us to the end of the issues and policies, recommendations, and so forth. And kind of as I mentioned, as we get into the rest of this, like I said, there's a few spots that would kind of bring up, the goals and policies that you'd want. The vast bulk of the rest of Chapter 6 is background informational stuff. It's kind of providing those guidelines that need to be included within the land use plan under MLUPA. I'll just kind of step through these, but just keep in mind it's more factual background than a policy determination through most of what's remaining in the chapter. We broke this up with environmental considerations, kind of talk about the general climate, looking at hydrology and water resources. We do call some things out here about Flathead Valley's relatively pristine water quality is of high value, so that's certainly something that we wanted to include in there. But again, it's kind of just identifying that there's the evergreen alluvial aquifer, discussing things like Ashley Lake and so forth. Talks about the nature of water pollution and where some of that comes from.
Just a question with the sewer plant, that last paragraph there. Our plant is specifically built to address phosphorus, but not nitrogen, or is that correct? Or yeah,
Keith, answer that.
Could you explain how our plant works, and then also why? I know this paragraph sort of highlights the fact that it's not something that we can, the environmental standards might be changing, and it's not something we can just easily switch.
Right. Yeah, we have a biological nutrient removal treatment so that we're not adding chemicals to do the treatment. But our plant does treat both nitrogen and phosphorus, and as well as, we have BOD limits. We have certain limits that we have to meet before we can flow back into Ashley Creek. Whereas I think kind of what you're getting at is the septic systems are non-point source. We're considered a point source, and so we have to treat to those DQ requirements.
Okay, thank you.
And there's a section here on floodplain, kind of identifying when some of those major floods occurred. It does call out some of the 100-year floodplains offering numerous benefits to property owners and community, and list those: flood storage, controlling, flood velocities. And again, just stepping through factual background, including, when some of this, the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968, and then later on when Flathead County and the three cities joined NFIP in 1984. Recognize that we've got adopted flood insurance studies, and all that goes through FEMA and through DNRC. It's something that the city council adopts as part of our floodplain ordinance, is the maps, but it's kind of established at a level above us. And then just kind of some mapping, including the FEMA floodplains, kind of showing with the Hungry Horse Dam failure what you'd be looking at through here. Groundwater and depth to water table, and just kind of identifying what that is, recognizing.
Can you go back to that real quick? One more? That right there shows you why we don't have a lot of properties that are in part of this community rating system. Very little red, say, where it says Kalispell. And even in those red areas, typically all the properties are outside of that. Whereas you look down in Evergreen, it's all in it. So that's why there's very little need for us to have done that in the past.
So I've seen different, I've seen like I'm wondering if it's because of Phil that it used to be 100-year floodplain, but like the kind of the southwest part of the development, the part of town, Bluestone kind of area, that was kind of, it's 500 year.
So this is another place where it kind of talks about the groundwater, looking at some of the aquifers that are out there, kind of recognizing, and I think we kind of touched base in here before about how a lot of our groundwater feeds into Flathead Lake. So there's some broader issues, even if it's not within our jurisdictional area, that are tied together with that. Looking at and identifying some of the specific aquifers that are out there.
Ms. Gabriel.
PJ, I just had a question on that number 1. I'm wondering if there's a word missing, the last sentence of number 1, northwest of, extending north from,
Okay, yeah, there's probably something that's in there.
just a word
Okay,
or a place.
yeah,
Okay. Just want to make sure I read it right.
yeah. So we'll fix that up. And then we've included this depth to water table, and you can see in here with the deeper red being 5 feet and then 10 and 15 feet. And similar to the floodplains, you can kind of see where a lot of that is focused, along the rivers, which mostly aren't in the city, but do kind of have some, especially with Ashley Creek, some overlap there.
I do think, given that map, that if we talked about some extra review or consideration of any kind of potential polluting underground storage tanks of potentially polluting material, that it's not when you exclude evergreen stuff, it's not a lot of the city. You were mentioning there was another place that might be good for kind of a discussion of that. Is this kind of the area you were thinking?
Well, I think that there was, and we kind of talked about with some of the issues and so forth, where we talked about shallow aquifers and the potential need to regulate something there. And, again, what something like that being called out as a goal within this chapter then sets the stage. And, part of it is it's kind of a difficult situation anyway. I'm not sure how much we can regulate underground tanks because the state does that through DEQ, and we can't necessarily regulate that differently. I'm not sure how much we can in that situation. But that's where that's where it would come into play, is you would use that goal out of here to provide the basis for a future regulation that would directly address that to the extent you could, if that's what the council chose to do.
Yeah, I mean, again, struggle with these things that are much bigger conversations, but, language that says explore the issue or whatever. But in terms of, like, if we did do something, I imagine it'd be through zoning, right? You'd zone these areas and say in these areas,
Potentially, you'd have to see where it is. And again, it's kind of an interesting thing because, you could put something into site specific. You could require that, before somebody builds a house that they need to, and we kind of do that through subdivisions. But, before there's a development, that you determine where the water table is, and if it's at a certain level, then you can do a tank. I'm not sure if that would come in through zoning per se, or if it would be through one of the other branches of the city. And again, I'm not even sure if we can, because the state regulates that through DEQ.
I think where it would tie in there is that you look at the growth policy map, right? If you had a general goal about taking into consideration the impacts of, like, say, a petroleum tank in high groundwater areas, which makes sense, you would tend to then not zone it a commercial designation that would allow for that. So you would just kind of say, in high groundwater areas, you're typically going to be limited to residential only, and that's the way you would go about that, which you could see generally that's what we're doing. Even by just looking at this map, you could kind of see that, but that would be the way to go about that. So,
and this is a piece, again, to expand on that, when somebody comes in with a subdivision application, they are giving us a geotech typically as part of that too, which identifies some of the groundwater. But it does kind of call out situations where in some subdivisions we said, well, you can't have, it's got to be slab on grade. You can't do basements or crawl spaces. And, certainly, as Jared said, that might be if somebody's planning on coming in and putting in a gas station, and something on this map as part of that says, it's not a good idea there with that. But that's how it typically comes into play.
yeah, and that's where I think, I mean, again, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. Like, is this, and do these fail in a way that would potentially cause a problem? And, how far underground are they? And then how much, like, soil space would you need to, if there was a leak, to kind of, have it filter out before it gets to the groundwater table? And so there's kind of some more work that needs to go into looking out whether or not this is something we should really pursue. But then if it turns out that, yes, these do occasionally fail, and if your groundwater table is within 15 feet, you're going to be polluting that water source, and that water source is going to get into our river and into our lake and affect water quality, then we want to adopt some sort of review process for development proposals that come forward and say, you've got a gas station that's going in where the groundwater table is 5 feet. No, we don't. We're not going to approve that.
And like I said, to some extent, DEQ regulations address that. City hasn't been historically directly involved in those type of regulations because they are done by the state, and they're permitted by the state, and they're inspected by the state. So I'm not sure how much more there is there that could be addressed, other than kind of what we've touched base on about not setting the stage for that by approving a subdivision or zone change to something that would encourage something you wouldn't want there. And what's in here would support that. Again, I'm just not familiar enough with the DEQ regs, other than to know from some of the projects we have worked on that they're pretty tight when it comes to that.
it is a planning document, so it is important if there are issues with it, and there's a big cost to cleanup of these tanks as well. I mean, we see it. So if it's something you could prevent and we could plan for in our growth area, it's something we could account for. Yeah, existing tanks and things, they're there, but certainly it's something based off of, you know, if it aligns with the growth policy and things, that we can add some language in there that would at least want to consider something along those lines, so.
And jumping here, you know, stormwater runoff, this is another place we kind of talked about it. Again, this is kind of more just background information, talks about the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, some of the background to some of the environmental regs that we work with the city with that. There's a section on wetlands, and it calls out some of the benefits that you'd see with that. One of the reasons why we have a fair amount of wetlands here with the number of rivers that come together, and then a map that kind of supports where you see those wetlands. Kind of to expand on that, it's not in here, but within our subdivision regulations, that's something that we would look at as part of a subdivision that comes through, and just another illustration of how the regulations tie back to what this document is. Topography, you saw on that environmentally sensitive area map, where we have those significant issues with topography and slopes. And this is just kind of calling out in this specific area. And again, you can kind of see where that's really focused on the southwest part of town. Soils is certainly an issue. In some areas you've got hydric soils. Sometimes you might have instability, again, tying back to some of those river bluffs that we see and that have been called out in a couple other locations here. This is the map calling out the hydric soils. Agricultural soils would be similar. Something, again, in subdivision regulations that we would typically look at would be the impact on farm area. And this important farmlands map, looking at prime if irrigated, and farmland of statewide importance is something that we do look at as part of subdivision review. And it's just kind of a general soils map that would be in there with types of soils. Seismic is something that most people really don't recognize. We're actually kind of a fairly active seismic area. One reason I think people don't really see is a lot of them tend to happen really well below the surface, but it can be an impact, and that's reflected in our building codes and what we would see here. But we're actually somewhat on par with a lot of areas of California, which people think of as being much more seismic than what we have here. But it is something, again, that's incorporated into the building codes that they look at with both residential and commercial development when building permits go through. And this is kind of highlighting that area, especially in the Kalispell area. You can kind of see it's kind of starting to get up on those higher hazard area maps. But to some degree, most of western Montana is kind of in a seismically sensitive area.
And I appreciate that we listed out and highlight that it is an issue that faces here. Eventually I think it comes into a conversation I would love to see us have in the future about historic downtown and why we should probably have some more seismic studies done, because you can lose a historic collection of buildings through an earthquake, and it usually is because of tuck pointing, and it's just unfortunate. But it's nice that it's highlighted here. I just sort of think in the future it might be one of those things we want to reference back when we look at historic downtown, that there might be more, because we do it for new build, but not necessarily for these older brick buildings.
Right.
But not necessarily appropriate for this document.
Okay. Air quality is called on here, and kind of goes back to some of the EPA studies that were done in the late 90s, where we're a non-attainment area for dust particulates, and that's why we've got a paving standard in the city where we don't allow gravel driveways or gravel parking lots like you might see in other areas in the county.
One of the things on that, as I understand that wintertime air quality is impacted by the wood burning stoves in the area, and that's the major contributing factor to air quality in the wintertime. I didn't see any reference to that, but that'd be, I think, probably a good thing to reference as an issue.
To mention that can impact it too.
Yeah.
And I think to some degree it's not nearly the same issue that it used to be. I mean, I grew up here, and you saw wood stacks all over the place, but no, it still can be a contributing factor to that. I think Missoula especially has seen that. It's not here, but they have a similar situation where we've got the valley that can kind of cap some of that stuff in the winter time. So it's certainly something that we can discuss in there.
Yeah, and whether, when we get to, if you have recommendations or whatever, are there examples of incentive programs getting people to switch to cleaner burning wood stoves, or, I know they have, the newer ones are much better, efficient and cleaner than the older ones. And if you can get people to switch them out or something, that could be beneficial.
Isn't that like the preferred method of burning? I mean, that's carbon to carbon, right?
Technically, it's carbon neutral.
Yeah.
Burning wood. Yeah.
As long as you have like 100-year.
I mean, it might actually impact our wintertime air quality, but compared to like a forest fire, it's like nothing, right? That's our major concern, and I think this year is going to be, if we don't get some more snow, we're going to have that problem.
Next section here was the wildland urban interface, which becomes more of an issue as you go further out, especially towards the western part of town. And it's something that is important to keep in mind as things move forward. The next group that we'd have here would be looking at wildlife. Kind of calls out riparian habitat. There's a long list down here of some of the different species that you would see in there. It talks about the Stillwater Game Preserve and much of the Evergreen area, Lone Pine Game Preserve to the southwest of Kalispell, which I've already kind of touched base on with that. And again, with all the rivers that are coming through, there are a fair number of areas that would have this type of habitat that would be available. And again, we've got a map that's supportive of this.
Sorry, when we get into these, because we get asked often, we are not the experts when it comes to this. We rely on the experts. We don't create the maps. We rely on Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and the applicable agencies to do that, just like FEMA, just like anything. So any of these maps, we didn't create them, we didn't map them. We've talked to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. They're the experts. We use them. Just so the council's aware on that.
It does look at some of the fisheries, which we don't really have in Kalispell, but they're around and contribute to that environment. The type of grasslands that we would have out in the area. And then forested uplands that come from there. Certainly getting some of the specific species. It's no surprise there's a lot of deer out there throughout the entire area. It's reflected in these documents as far as both the text and the map, both in terms of whitetail and mule. There are elk in the area, and as you kind of get off towards the west, you can start getting into some of their summer range.
I think with elk, one of the things that would be, in reference to the comment about kind of pulling from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, I think it'd be good to reference that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks have not mapped the elk travel corridors in the valley. Because when it comes to new development, that's something I hear all the time. If an area where the elk spend a lot of time is being targeted for development, whether it's in our community or some other communities in the valley, people are really focused on where those elk are and where they spend a lot of their time. And I have asked unsuccessfully Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to map those areas so that we have some sense, because they're not just kind of anywhere. There's specific areas that they like to travel between and through, and so I think it's worth noting that we do not have those maps. They have not been mapped, but they are real. There are real places that are heavily used by the elk.
I might even expand that, not just elk, right? Like, we don't know all the wildlife travel corridors that go through our cities, right? We don't have any of those maps. I haven't seen anything.
Well, we know that wildlife use
Right.
the riparian zones as travel corridors, so we can, and that's something I've referenced a lot. But we can count that for a lot of wildlife travel corridors. Obviously, there's some species are going to be a little bit different, and they use like the elk overland stuff, and potentially what the elk are identifying as areas are going to apply to some other species as well. But yeah, that's obviously there could be some that we're missing that aren't mapped as well.
We have sections addressing moose, black bear, grizzly, mountain lions, migrating waterfowl. And list a number of species there. This is where we put in some specific reference to sandhill cranes. There was a number of amount of discussion that kind of came up with that. Essentially what we say here is that, sandhill cranes are one example of migrating waterfowl that utilize sites within the land use plan area. Areas of West Valley have pothole wetlands and other features which serve as important habitats as the cranes migrate to the south in the fall. Those areas also serve as habitat for other migrating waterfowl as well, and reasonable consideration should be given to minimize impact on those areas.
So would it be helpful then to have it on the map as well, just since it's only, it's in the
It's not
text?
mapped. and
No,
we're not
but
the
I'm wondering if
experts.
that's something we should, I know Fish, Wild and Parks does it. Is there anywhere?
I mean,
Yeah,
city gonna fund that?
yeah.
Flat and Land Trust provided a map. I mean,
There was a map that we were given, but it was basically an oval that covered everything kind of in that area, and it wasn't overly specific to the particularly sensitive spots. And that's one reason why we didn't include that in here, because it really did take like that whole quarter kind of out.
You could
because
apply
they
that
use
map to the entire valley floor. They're everywhere. I mean, there's a concentration of them, but you can't, we should be relying on the experts for these findings. And certainly there should be a study that identifies critical habitat, but to just put basically a blob over the entire West Valley and say this is habitat. It's like, well, they're also at Smith Lake. They're all over. So it was not really something that we're comfortable with using as a land use plan document. Not to say there shouldn't be one, not to say Fish, Wildlife, and Parks shouldn't be analyzing it and shouldn't be analyzing all the corridors, but that's what, as planners, we use to make the findings to then justify land use decisions. We can't just kind of apply a general map to
It
something.
sounds like we need something like that, because I know that area, as sensitive it is for sandhill cranes, the elk are also using that. My wife and I went out to visit a couple weeks ago, and there was 50 elk out there in a big herd walking through the agricultural land. So if we don't know what's out there, I feel like we're going to be underselling it, I guess, is the importance of it.
Well, I would say we spoke with the experts, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks' biggest concern is not the habitat as much as it is human-wildlife conflict. So if Fish, Wildlife, and Parks isn't trying to protect it or maintain it as critical habitat, you can see. So I think
What's the
it's
difference?
what's
Where the funding is.
You were talking about
No,
cranes,
like
Fish, Wildlife, Parks.
what's the
then
difference between
we're talking
human
about-
contact and development? And those seem very similar.
Can I ask a question? I appreciate you updating all the maps into the full planning area. I still have a hard copy of the original one, and was comparing the map on the important riparian habitat to the updated one, which you all updated. And there's quite a few places that you updated on the new map that weren't identified at the old map. Forest Lake, a couple places along the Stillwater, I believe. And so I'm wondering if specifically as you updated that map, whether or not there was a conversation with FWP and the experts regarding that sandhill crane potholes, and whether or not, I guess.
Policy plan. So I'm not sure why there was differences there, other
It
than.
could be the scale.
could be
This map
scales or
is not,
something.
I'm not sure which areas you're referencing, but we don't even create the map. So,
Yeah, that's why I was wondering why there were differences between the one from a month and a half ago versus the one that's now. Because there were maybe 3 or 4 different places that were added in the new map. And so I'm just kind of wondering the genesis of that.
I think part of it is, as far as putting these maps on paper or getting a PDF for it, that goes through our GIS department. And so they could be pulling off of a newer layer that they access layers that they put on there from other state agencies and so forth. And there could have been some updates on that kind of came through. But there wasn't like we didn't step through like each individual area with Fish and Wildlife and Park to identify those specifically. It was more of a general discussion and kind of a reaffirmation of the general information that we had in place.
Sure. All right. I'm just trying to figure out the methodology of that, because if we're identifying new places, it certainly seems like those spots would be ones that the council would be in favor of adding in terms of important riparian wildlife habitat. But if there's some sort of threshold in terms of how that information needs to come in, I can respect that, but I'm just trying to figure out what that is.
I think that's where that came from. And in terms of the yeah, I mean, that's the best answer I can give you on that.
Okay.
You want to send me a copy of both? Because we just use a layer. We haven't changed anything, so I don't know. I don't even know which areas you're talking about that either got on or off. So yeah, if you want to send that over, we could clarify that. But yeah, we don't edit the map in one way or another. We take a layer and it goes right on there. So we don't create the map. We don't, other than getting in a shapefile and putting it on. That's how we do it. So.
Ms. Gabriel.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just a question on 6.2.12 migrating waterfowl, and I wanted to ask this back when we were on page 90-something, and decided to wait because I knew this was coming. We talked about wildlife and waterfowl. Would anyone be opposed to making that broader? We are in one of the biggest migratory bird systems, flyways, in the country. So we're not talking just cranes or just geese and ducks. We're talking all of the raptors, all of the songbirds. I mean, some of them are flying to Costa Rica, and they just come on through. Is it possible to broaden that conversation to be bigger than waterfowl? So when we're talking about habitats and things like that, because it's so important to all of them that have to stop, along the way.
Yeah. And we can certainly broaden that. And this wasn't, and certainly that's kind of came into the language where we said sandhill cranes are one example of migrating
Right.
waterfowl. We can certainly broaden that language to include migrating birds as opposed to just waterfowl. It wasn't intended to necessarily be narrow in that sense.
Well,
but
I
that's
get
where the
it.
language
And
came.
all migratory birds are protected, so I think it's a valid thing to look at. And I can see if I can find more information for you on that too.
Okay.
Just tell them I asked, and they'll say, sure, sure.
Okay.
And I just want to clarify a point about the West Valley wetlands and the cranes. So cranes, yes, are found all over the valley. They are found in pairs in small numbers all over the valley. What makes the West Valley wetlands unique is that you can find 400 of them in the fall. The numbers of them is what makes it so unique relative. Now, we can destroy that habitat and have a few of them there like we have elsewhere in the valley, but I think that would be a tragedy. And there may be, as we had discussions there, that may be inevitable. But in terms of the map that was provided, that was kind of a circle, the reason for that is because those pothole wetlands are favored by the cranes in those large numbers because of the way that they're pothole wetlands. They're particularly suited for what the cranes like in the evening. And then they fly out during the day to the ag fields in the area. And they only fly a certain distance. Obviously, they want to, get to their place and feed, but they need enough ag fields they eat enough of one ag field and then they go to the next one and so on. And so it's kind of a radius around those pothole wetlands of a certain distance. And all the ag field that's within the distance from those pothole wetlands are ag fields that they will potentially use at one point or another while they're in the area. And so if we want to, just use that distance and rather than have a oval like the map was provided and just map the open ag fields that's within that oval to make it more specific, that's fine. But that's why, it was fuzzy. Yeah, because it's just like riparian habitat, right? We can't say exactly where the bears are that are moving through that riparian. At any one point, the bears might be moving through that riparian zone, but we know that riparian zones are areas that these animals move through, and that's why we map the whole thing. So.
Well, it sounds like the cranes were drawn there by a man-made feature already, right? Because the ag fields, right? You could possibly. I guess I'm a little bit curious right now. What you're asking us to do in this area. I know at one time we had the discussion about whether we were going to put it into our growth area or not, right? I am still really strongly feel that it should be in our growth area so that we can do something about it. If it's not in our growth area, we're just at the will of the county or whoever purchases that land in the future. But yeah, I guess my biggest question is, what are we trying to get to? We've talked about the sandhill cranes and that pothole wetlands area quite a bit. What goal are we trying to get to?
So, from the conversation we had before, the argument of leaving it in the growth area was that it gives, or at least one of the arguments, is it gives staff the opportunity to kind of like weigh in and consider it and factor it in and write to the county, the county about development that might occur out there and stuff. If that's what we're going to do, then at the very least, we should treat it as an environmentally important enough area like we are doing with these other things and map it. And call it an environmentally sensitive area and map the habitat so that it's there that we can say, yes, we have designated this area as a particularly important area, just like riparian zones and other things, and it's going to require special attention.
But you're not talking about the city doing that effort, right? That would be some environmental agency or some environmental group out there.
So I'm saying that Flat Land Trust, as experts who have been actively involved in conserving this habitat for, or wanting to conserve it for a long time, we've provided information. I think, if we want, I don't know who's being talked to at Fish, Wildlife Parks. I'd be like, if they're saying this is an important area or whatever, I'd like to talk to that person. But because that's certainly not, the message. They're partners with us and try and conserve areas. So I'm quite shocked by that comment. But I think it should be mapped, and I think we have enough information to map it.
I think what Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is doing is they're acknowledging private property rights and what they're seeing. For example, there's no critical elk habitat on the elk habitat map in the growth policy area. They're acknowledging the forest lands and stuff. If you want something beyond that, they haven't mapped it. They haven't felt a reason to map it. I'm not saying that there's not critical habitat there, but Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, the experts, the agency that manages the wildlife, does not have a map for them, for these particular areas. If the city wanted to do something, then certainly it's in the council's prerogative to map or pay to have a wildlife study done for certain areas. I would say that a better scenario would be to leave it in a growth area, and as the development pressures happen out there, that would be a requirement to the developer to do that, which the city can do that. If it's not in the growth area and it's developing in a county, that won't happen.
But we can't do any of that if we don't first identify the area. So in our growth plan with a map.
Well, I think in some ways it's identified in here. It's not mapped. And so that was the purpose of putting this in here, was kind of a response to some of the public comment and council discussion that came in, is acknowledging that there's areas of West Valley, like you see in here, areas of West Valley have pothole wetlands and other features, and that consideration should be given to minimize impact on those areas. So it was intended to put it in there. It was intended to create a basis for something, but it's difficult to go too far beyond that within the confines of this document at this time.
Well, and within our jurisdiction.
It's it's in within our planning area, but not within a jurisdiction that we would do anything with. And you're certainly seeing subdivisions that are happening out there. There's 100 acres that's preliminary platted in the county that's going to develop in the county unless we expand our growth boundary around it and bring it into the city. When it's in the city, we have a lot more control over maybe clustering that, trying to respect certain areas or try to minimize that. Otherwise, you're going to have 80, 90 lots on septic tanks right there. And then you're going to see the next development happening beyond that that's not going to be adjacent to sewer. And they're then all the more likely to put it on more septics. I think the benefits of being able to cluster, certainly if you're taking 100 acres and creating 100-acre lots, you're really tearing that apart in terms of potential areas for habitat. But if you can allow some of the clustering that can come with city sewer, then you can have some of those bigger areas, especially when you're starting to talk about 100-acre tracts or 200-acre tracts that people might be able to develop. So there's a lot of things to kind of consider when it comes through there. And what we intended to do was kind of put the basis for some of those thought processes down the road with what we put into the document here.
And I appreciate that work and just adding the section in about sandhill cranes. I guess one thing which I'm missing, I see, is sort of in that first section where you bring up the blue heron cranes, but you list out other things like the Stillwater Game Preserve and Lone Pine Game Preserve. Like, could we list like the viewing shed there, the viewing blind there, as just being one of those other things it is already in conservation. It exists. We're citing other sort of preserves and things that are within
Included in that list? Yeah, certainly.
just putting it in that list. I mean, I'm not sure that it solves all the issues that are there about maps and stuff like that, but at least we're citing the fact that there is conservation, there is a viewing blind there, the same way that we're noting
we
the
can
other
certainly
preserves.
call something out like that. That's fine.
That would be my suggestion of a place to acknowledge the conservation and the viewing shed that's already there. Because we're doing that with some other preserves.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not trying to give anybody flack about this being an environmentally sensitive area. I just don't understand what we're trying to get to, right? Other than calling it out here and making sure that if we put it in our growth area, and if it does come to the planning board at some time for something to be built there, right, that we've called it out here, and we want them to look at it, really closely and make sure that it's not going to be something that interferes with our habitat. But, other than what we've already done, I'm just trying to figure out what else we're trying to do with that, because quite frankly, it's just taking a lot of council time, and I'm not sure where we're going.
Well, and I think a good route here as well would be partnering to map things. The waterfowl, Audubon, I mean, there's a lot of grant opportunities out there that don't necessarily have to be generally government funded, but partnering with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks as opportunities come to, we could help them write the grant to then map the area, but certainly we need their expertise. The staff here at the city is not wildlife experts. That's not what we do, and we're not going to pretend to be that. So,
Can we add that as a goal then,
if the council wants to do
for this
that,
environmental section to
Yeah, that's
partner
fine.
with somebody and get
I'm
it?
also worried about if we map it, it's a city-owned map, and then maybe nobody above us respects that map at all, right? So anyway, I just want to make sure that I know where we're heading with this, so I can form intelligent discussion items about it, because right now I'm still really confused. I do understand the area. I do understand the cranes that migrate there. But the part that I don't understand is what we're trying to do in the future with it. In my aspect, I can only see that bringing it into our growth plan gives us the most say in what happens there, right? So that's basically where I was heading with this.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking it also is an opportunity to educate a lot of people who don't know about it. So when I was reading it, that's how I took it, as how can we use this document to make sure people understand, who might be new to the community, what the value of this is beyond.
Well, quite frankly, I hadn't heard of it before until
Me
we
neither.
started
That's why
talking about it, right?
Yeah.
So exactly what you're talking about. I would love to make this a city attraction, right? To have more people go out there and view them. I'd love to actually have it be a thing that people come to Kalispell for, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Agreed.
with all that I really would love to do a partnership with somebody and hopefully get it to be a conservation easement, with the addition of us being able to maybe we run a bus out there to the viewing shed, and it's a city thing, right?
Do a town hall out there.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that I understand exactly where we're going with this, because I guess I was confused about our earlier session when we were talking about whether to put it in the growth plan or not. I don't see any advantage to the city of not putting it in the growth plan. I don't see any advantage to the cranes for the city not to put it in the growth plan. That's kind of where I'm heading with it. And I understand that part of this document is our growth area plan. So this is pertinent to what we're talking about tonight. So I would love to see that I don't know where I stand with the rest of the council, but I would love to see that in our area because I want it to be on us. You know, I want us to have a say in it. I don't want things to happen out there and to get ruined before we even have a chance to do anything about it.
But ultimately, it's still private property.
Right now,
Right, and
exactly,
it's-
100%. This just protects the future of
Correct.
when, eventually, I can guarantee you that the farmlands near Kalispell are going to be sold.
Yep.
Right? We don't like it. It's what's happening, and I just want to make sure that we have a little bit more control over what happens with that area than if it were just outside of our growth plan.
Well, and I would tend to agree, and I find it a interesting dichotomy of this, of we started out of how do we keep people from going out and sprawling out into the county, and we talk about how that's regulations and taxation and all of that forces people to go out onto bigger pieces of property, and then we find ways to spend money and regulate it more so that it forces people out to build in the county and sprawl. So I think there's a happy balance that we also need to have within all of this, so that we aren't making that incentive and hanging the carrot out in the county,
Definitely. And
right? We
there's
want
things
to have the carrot hanging in the city.
there's things that we could potentially do here on council that would make that land more expensive and probably prompt those guys to sell faster, right? So I'm also taking all that into consideration when I'm saying that as well. So anyway, I just wanted to put my 2 cents in. I was still a little bit fuzzy about end goal here, but I do like that we call it out here. I'd like to expand on this in the future and make it a city thing, right? Anyway, my 2
I think that
cents.
would start with a proper wildlife study. I think is what we're kind of getting back to. Is we don't really know, the critical important, how critical. It hasn't been mapped. It hasn't been documented. I feel like there'd be a lot of benefit to getting some wildlife study as a goal. If we can partner with somebody who's
we
got
could-
the expertise. Yes, not us
Yeah.
personally doing it, but commissioning an expert to do that kind of study so we have better information to work with.
And it
But
sounds
again,
like
that goes
there's enough
back to the
interest
money
out
part.
there
Right.
that we
That's
can
why
get
we
this.
partner with somebody.
Yeah.
And have them,
It sounds like there's enough
grants
interest out there that we could get somebody to do this without having to spend taxpayer money on
Yeah.
it, basically.
that would be ideal.
Yeah.
We'll move on.
Okay, so next section that we've got is just addressing wildlife-human conflict. This is one of the things that, as Jared mentioned, that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks was particularly concerned about, in addition to the sprawl, but just how that interaction happens. Reducing the sprawl tends to reduce the wildlife-human conflict that you have out there. We do have, we kind of talked about the maps we have showing some elk habitat, white-tailed deer density, moose habitat. Next general section has to deal with natural resources. Since we kind of already talked a lot about this in prior sections, didn't really put too much into here, but talking about water resources, surface water within the area, groundwater, certainly the evergreen aquifer being, a prime component of that. Wetlands, floodplain, soil resources, again, all things that were discussed in more depth prior to this. One section that is in here, partly because it is something that we have in the general vicinity, but also because Malupa says to specifically look at it, is sand and gravel resources. And it's just kind of identifying some of the things out there, looking at generous buffers around that. I think that there's some interplay with some of the state regulations on gravel pits about some of the buffering that they have to do as part of that. And then also touching on forest and vegetation resources. And that, as long as
Okay,
we get past that
map's
map.
ridiculous.
Yep,
I'm
there's-
sorry, it's just ridiculous. All it is county get mapped as urban interface, right? Because there's little pockets right in the middle of town that are county, but seriously,
That's almost like the map
Downtown.
of turkeys and bunnies.
right? Like there's core areas of downtown are marked as wildlife urban interface. Like
So-
They didn't think Palisades.
Right?
I mean, we live in a WUI, so that's why the map is that way. I mean, you get a wind event, and with
Well,
our
right through.
grasses and our open spaces all around us, it gets into a residential neighborhood. It's so that
And that's the argument for all of it to be not
yeah,
outside the city limits.
once again, we don't create the map.
I understand.
And then the last one in here was just identifying land cover with, you know, types of grasses and so forth. So there's just a lot of information came together on that. And then that takes us to chapter 7. So is there anything anybody wanted to touch base on or revisit with chapter 6?
And these things. So it's a balance, right? And so yes, that's why they probably haven't mapped it, because well, the entire floor is elk habitat. You know, so, but certainly there's corridors and things that would be nice to identify so you can protect those areas, because as we do look at the rivers, they're pretty much north-south, but eventually they gotta get east-west, and that's where our roads are going. So, you know, if you cut those corridors off, that's where it would be nice to have something like that, but it's not something that has been identified in any study or any mapping or anything like that, so.
Okay. So in chapter 7, what this is really doing is incorporating the future land use map. I think as we
So
mentioned,
hold on, I think we're probably gonna do chapter 7 next week. I think,
it's, however you want to do it.
I think so. I think we're
Okay.
we're getting late and Mr. Dowd has to go, so I think we'll save it for the next, try to get through it, the rest of it
Here's that
next
work with you
week.
with the
3
timetable that we
chapters.
laid out. Okay.
Okay.
And
So-
you mean next work session, right?
Next, yes, next
Okay.
work session. All right, yeah. So we did have public comment at the beginning, but since we had a lot of discussion, I'll open it up one more time for anyone wishing to address the council. Step to the mic or raise your hand if you're online.
Okay, I just want to remind everybody that you're talking of private
State your name,
property.
please.
Kendi Nelson, Liberty Street, Kalispell. We're having this major discussion on property that is privately owned. The discussion should only be whether you're going to bring it into your growth area or not, period. That's it. You either bring it in or you don't bring it in. But there should be no other discussion of this city council. It's not your place to be discussing it, right? Like, it's in the county currently, and it's property that is privately owned. So I don't know why we've wasted probably a couple hours on this since you started with the plan. My 2 cents.
Step to the mic, please. State your name for the record.
Ryan LeGros. It sounded like you guys are having a Highway 2 zoning problem. And a lot of that's commercial heading up towards the Indian Reservation and there. I believe that's privately owned, but that's all zoned for commercial next to the airport. I had a couple questions. I know the scoreboard's gonna end up being sold, and I don't know if you guys are gonna keep the liquor license with the scoreboard or without. I believe it's been marked over there, but it might be some of the pot money that's gonna end up buying the scoreboard. I don't know if that's in your guys' outlook of the town, cause it sounded like you guys are going for a 20-year plan. From what I've seen in the paper, the health department's doing their regular checks, and I haven't heard anything for the fire codes, but just word around town is we've been having a lot of house structure fires, but that still goes with the Montana Royals bin. If it's your own property, build at your own will. It's not rules and regulations like the city. It's been a long time that they've actually just, if it's private property, build what you want. And since we're growing and turning it into a bigger city, I read something in there about the fire department needing a new spot, and I was wondering it was because the squat vehicle's parked over there, and when seconds count, an extra vehicle in your fire station might be a problem. I didn't know if we were looking for a place for that. I've heard words about a new jail being built, and is it gonna be a federal holding facility? Cause that would help out a bunch instead of just being a jail. We get more, with all the ICE detainees and stuff, you get more people being put in there, but then that also adds to the airports needing to transport those people. And I've heard we've been fixing fences on the secondary airport. I guess it would be, D would be the bypass, and then C would be the third one coming through town. I didn't know if anybody had heard anything about that needing new asphalt. I thought that was in the works. I don't want to fill your mind up with all that stuff. It seems like you guys are doing a really good job around here. It's just a lot of old timers passing away and house fires and zonings, but I think you guys are all doing a good job, especially in this administration and what we're all doing. You're like, you're at private property and still.
Hey guys, Nathan Dugan. Here's the executive director of Livable Flathead. We're up at 121 Wisconsin Avenue in Whitefish. It just struck me earlier. I wasn't planning to comment, but when Mayor Hunter was talking about the development on 93 North, kind of out of town, and traffic lights and traffic congestion and all that sort of stuff, there's a pretty good example of this about 3 hours away in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. I-95 or not US 95 North from I-90 about 10 miles up to Hayden. And so I think keeping that in mind and as a place where we will probably be population-wise in 20 to 50 years, and looking at that as an example could be helpful.
Okay, anybody online? Okay, I'll close public comment and city manager report.
My notes are, do have a meeting next week. There's quite a bit on the agenda, as well as during as the mayor had mentioned at the last meeting, and kind of stems into the discussion tonight, but the Whitefish, kind of following the Tronstad development, there was kind of a lot of concerns about obviously the Highway 93 corridor, especially between Kalispell and Whitefish, speeds, development, all those sorts of things. So MDT did initiate an access control plan. So it's not necessarily a corridor plan, but an access control plan. And they've been doing a lot of public outreach on that the last year and a half or so. And they do got a draft plan together. And I kind of reached out to them and suspected it would be good for them just to kind of do a brief presentation to the council, because I know that was something that got pretty contentious during that time. So we'll be looking at doing that at the next council meeting. Likewise, do you have a fifth Monday coming up? I know there's been a lot of discussion about that, so I'll be reaching out to see if there's something council wants to do. And that's all I got.
Council reports. We'll start this way.
I don't think I have anything.
Nothing.
Nothing.
This is just something I wanted to say last time, but it was getting late, and you put a lot of time, the staff, into this document. And I just want to acknowledge this is like 3 dissertations, and I haven't done a dissertation and had to face the committee saying one more thing, change one more thing. I thought they were trying to ruin my life sometimes. And so I can imagine how it might feel that way for you. So I just wanted to thank you for being so patient and entertaining. In contrast, I actually see this document as a very important educational tool. And so the information that we have on here is helpful for people coming into the community, trying to understand, for those of us making decisions. So the more informative it is, the more likely we'll have decisions that are made that are for the best welfare of everyone involved. So I just really appreciate your patience as we work through and discuss things and come up with the best way that we can do that. So thank you. And I'm not trying to ruin your life. You may feel that way.
Nothing more to add, but I agree. I mean, this is a really important navigational document, and I've been trying to think of it not only as somebody who knows all these things, but trying to think about it from the outside perspective, and really appreciate the staff time and effort to put together a comprehensive document like this, because it's really hard. But I do think that we're getting into some of those details that are important for, again, from that outside perspective, so that they're aware of the situation that they're coming into. So.
Yeah, I too would like to echo the councilwoman. It may not seem like it, but we kind of breeze through a ton of really substantive and incredible information. I'm constantly impressed by the depth of knowledge the staff has, and thank you for all of your work.
Yeah, I'm just overwhelmed a little bit at the how much this document encompasses. You got done with the growth plan right before I got on council the first time, right before me and Mayor Hunter came on. Boy, that's a lot of stuff to go through. And, reading on Saturday and Sunday, the only time I have to read is at night, some of this is fairly dry content to go through. But but I love history. So when we get to the historical parts that we always skip through in council, I'm like, this stuff is golden. I love it. But anyway, I appreciate all the effort that this takes, and I know that staff took our previous plan and modified it, but you've also done a lot of work just prepping for everything that we're asking for here on council. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Does Mr. Fisher having? Oh, okay. Yeah, I will echo that. We, in this process, we obviously are focusing a lot on what are changes we'd like to see, but not enough to say that, obviously there's so much good content in there and so much information, and appreciate all the work and expertise that goes into it. I want to respond to some of the public comment, just to say that a lot of things that were raised are outside of city jurisdiction. Highway 2 heading up to the airport is county land. It's not in the city at this time. The jail is a county jail. It's city's not involved. Liquor licenses, that pertains to the owner of the business and stuff. We don't have any involvement in that. We do have building code, fire code. That's in our building code, so we applied that. So let's see. Oh, it's the 5th Monday. So I did tell folks that I was going to be holding a town hall like event to invite people to have kind of more of a dialogue on the 5th Monday. I do intend to pursue that. We can talk about if anybody else wants to join that and kind of have a council thing. If you want, we can do that and notice it if need be. Up to you guys, but I do plan to do that for 5th Monday, because I've been talking about for quite some time now. So with that, we're adjourned, and we'll see you next week.